Okay, I propose that we get started. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. My name is Aziza Akmouche. I'm heading the division at the OECD that works on cities, urban policies, and sustainable development. It's my pleasure to moderate this hour-and-a-half webinar that will take you through some of the messages on our work on SDGs. We have about 300 participants online, probably a few more are logging in now. We're going to give ourselves a few seconds for everybody to get familiar with the different functionalities of the Zoom, and then we will shortly start. Good. I see numbers are going up, so let's maybe get started. Some very quick housekeeping arrangements for all of you. We are going to have a very lively and iterative and interactive webinar. We are inviting all of you, if we go to the next slides, Aline, please, to use as much as you can the social media throughout this hour and a half. You have on the screen our Twitter account. You can also in parallel log in to see the SDGs program webpage, which you can see on the right side of the slide. You can also have access to the report on the SDGs, which has a lot of details, in particular on this data related to the measurement of cities and regions distance under its second and third chapter. And you can also see online the shortcut for you to access the web tool that we will be showcasing. So as I said, the objective of this webinar is really to take you through some of the messages that have come out of the work that we launched at the OECD on a territorial approach to the SDGs almost 18 months ago. A lot has been done since then, and our colleagues will share with you some of the highlights, but we will focus in particular on the data component, and we will help you navigate through this online tool that measures the distance of 600 cities and 600 regions in OECD and partner countries to the different goals. Just for some background, for those of you who are not familiar with the OECD work on SDGs at large, you may need to know that back in 2016, the organization adopted what we call an SDG Action Plan, which provided for a whole of OECD strategy to really mainstream the achievement of the SDGs and the implementation of the 2030 agenda in our daily work, which really consists in advising policymakers on how to design and implement better policies for better lives, and therefore the many policy areas that the OECD touches upon actually coincide with the different sustainable development goals. And I'm very happy that we have amongst the close to 400 participants with us today, our Deputy Secretary General, Mr. Schlagenhaf, who is leading that OECD-wide effort on the SDGs. But we also have many colleagues from other directorates at the OECD, from statistics to Agenda 21, to environment, governance, education, and many more that are also working on a very daily basis with the Sustainable Development Goals. We will organize this webinar in four big sections. If we go to the next slide, you can see the structure that we are proposing. We will first welcome some introductory remarks from the chair of the OECD Regional Development Policy Committee, Flavia Terribile. We're very happy to have Flavia with us, who's basically leading this policy forum of senior officials in the OECD 37 countries that are in charge of regional development policies, place-based policies, which goes from rural to urban to issues related to decentralization, subnational finance, and that basically rely very much on local and regional data to help upscale the role of cities and regions in a range of policies. So we'll hear from Flavia first. We'll then move to Stefano Marta, who is in my team coordinating the work on a territorial approach to the SDGs, who'll share with you some of the key highlights that have come out of this work. And then we'll move to our two colleagues who've been working specifically on the data side of the program and the web tool. We'll hear first from Paolo Veneri, who is heading our territorial statistics and analysis unit in the OECD Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities, and who'll explain a bit the black box of how we've selected these indicators to make them OECD relevant and place relevant, and how we've come up with this data. And then we'll move to Marcos in his team. Marcos is one of the architects of this web tool, and this will be a very practical session where he will basically share his screen and show you what's behind the web tool that we launched at the 10th World Urban Forum in Abu Dhabi. We'll have a spot for Q&A, a good half an hour, so it's very important that throughout the webinar you raise your questions. Please use the Q&A function to do that rather than the chat, which is more for technical issues you may be facing, and we have the support team that is helping us very much to make this all very fluid and get it right. So with no further ado, maybe I will invite Flavia to say a few introductory words. Thank you very much, Flavia, for being with us. You've been one of the great champions of this work in the committee, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Ziza, and good morning to all. Oh, good evening, I don't know. So the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and their related 169 targets, which are at the heart of the United Nations 2030 Agenda, provide a comprehensive framework to analyze policies in an integrated manner, to promote synergies across policy sectors, and more importantly, to engage all relevant stakeholders in the policy-making process, including the private sectors, citizens, and the civil society. They also provide a framework to set more ambitious targets for policies, to monitor progress, and promote accountability. So regions and cities have core responsibilities in policies that are central to sustainable development. And in many OECD countries, they are increasingly using the SDGs framework to design and monitor policy strategies and investment plans. The OECD has identified that at least, I think, 100 out of the 169 targets require the full engagement and participation of regions and cities to deliver the intended policy results, policy outcomes. So I think that in these days that many cities and regions are starting to ease restrictions and focusing on the immediate responses to the crisis, it is very important to use this moment to promote a new stakeholder approach and also to rethink policies in such a way as to promote yes, a new stakeholder approach, but also to bounce forwards in the direction of building a more resilient, green, and inclusive society. The opportunity, this opportunity cannot be wasted in the name of urgency. This is very important. The policy decision of today, for example, what is it and is not included in the stimulus packages, in the safety net programs, will have a lasting effect on the society to come. So I think for this reason, the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals and Targets are more important than ever. And the work of the OECD, A Territorial Approach for the Sustainable Development Goals, can be even more crucial today by going beyond the averages, by looking at the very realities of people's life in the territories, by providing a place-based perspective to a wide range of policy priorities. To conclude, in these weeks in Europe, yesterday, you all read yesterday German and French initiative. We are all working, the countries are working at a new recovery and resilience tool in the framework of the new European budget in order to fund key public investment and reforms for a climate neutral, a more digitalized, a more resilient Europe. So it will be very important to reinforce the link between the Agenda 2030 and the European semester. The European semester is the main annual coordination instrument involving all European member states. And this will be very important to be able to face shocks, leaving no one behind, but also, and more importantly, without compromising the heritage for future generations. Thank you, Aziza.
Thank you very much, Flavia. We are now with 424 participants. Welcome to those that have just joined. We've just heard introductory remarks from the chair of the Regional Development Policy Committee on the importance of shedding light on what's happening at local and regional level, in particular in these difficult and uncertain times that will require recovery measures at the very local level in terms of performing with the SDGs. Thank you, Flavia. Let us now pursue the webinar. And before we hear from the OECD experts and also the two chairs of the OECD Working Party on Urban Policy, and I welcome Vincent Fouchier and the chair of the OECD Working Party on Territorial Indicators, who will wrap up at the end of the webinar and introduce some of the next steps. Before we get there, we would like to maybe take a bit the temperature and invite you to participate in a first Zoom poll. Everybody can vote. So the 430 plus participants, please feel free to vote. You will see soon on the screen. Nicolina will make the poll appear for your background. The question that we are asking you, and we are asking you to pick one response. So we know all of this may qualify, but we would like to understand what is the most important for you. So here is the question. What is for you the most important benefit of granular data on cities and regions' performance against the SDGs? One top priority for you. Is it to go beyond the national average and to show disparities within a given country? Is it to evaluate whether a city or a region is on track to achieve with the SDGs? Is it to learn about front runners and best practices? Or is it to guide local policy strategies and decision-making processes? So please.
The question have disappeared on the screen.
So
okay.
Now they're here, very good. So please feel free to vote. Tick one question. I will ask the OECD Secretariat not to end the polling yet. We are looking at the numbers, so we have a good 70 out of 400. Let's take 30, 40 more seconds until we have a critical mass. So pick one of the four options: going beyond national average, evaluating whether a city or region is on track, learning from front runners, or guiding local policy strategies and decision-making process. We have a good half, a bit more. I see numbers are still going up, so let's take an additional 20, 30 seconds. Everybody can vote. There seems to be a good majority so far for guiding local policy strategies and decision-making. Numbers seem to stabilize, so let's wait an additional 20 seconds and then maybe Nicolina, you can end the polling and show the final results. Good. So we have a good half, as you can see on the screen, that puts really the emphasis on guiding local policies and strategies, which I think is very interesting because that's the core mission of the OECD, followed by tracking where local and regional governments stand, and some of you also emphasizing the need to unpack somehow regional disparities and to learn from front runners and best practices. This is great. So we can stop sharing the results. Good. And now maybe we move to the first OECD speaker. If we go to the next slide, and it's my pleasure now to welcome Stefano, who's been really the mastermind of this big work on a territorial approach to the SDGs. Stefano, you have the floor to share some of the highlights of the overall program, and then we'll get into the data and the web tool.
Thank you very much, Aziza. And we can move to the next slide, Alina. So the result of the first poll are really very interesting because this was actually the core objective of the program. The idea was really to see how the SDGs can be used by cities and regions to formulate and reshape a policy from the ground up beyond the compliance agenda. The program started 18 months ago, and the idea was to focus on these three key objectives. The first one was about learn how the SDGs can be used as a means to reshape policy, to manage trade-off, and to strengthen multi-level governance and coordination across levels of government. The second objective, that is really the focus of this webinar, is about producing this indicator framework to help cities and regions measure progress on the SDGs. And the third objective was about sharing and guiding. So we did this through some pilots, the 9 pilots that you can see on this slide. I will not go through that because for the sake of time. And we also produce a checklist for public action to localize the SDGs. Next slide, please, Arina. So the idea, what we propose is the territorial approach to SDGs as a tool to implement a new regional development paradigm. A regional development paradigm has been developed by the OECD for almost a decade and is based on the idea to shift from a sectoral to a multi-sectoral approach to regional development, from one-size-fits-all and universal policy to context-specific and place-based intervention, and from top-down policy making to a bottom-up approach to policy making. All this in a multi-level governance, through a multi-level governance approach. And the SDGs really provide a right framework to implement and to further develop this OECD regional development paradigm. Next slide, please, Alina. We also developed an analytical framework for this program. And the analytical framework, the first question, the first step was first to understand how the SDGs can help cities and regions in making the most of some mega trends that are affecting local and regional government, in particular climate change, urbanization, demographical changes, and digitalization. Our analytical framework is based on 3 main pillars: policy and strategies, tools, so which are the tools that can help cities and regions implementing the SDGs, using the SDGs as a policy-making tool to improve their local development policy, and actors, so how to use the SDGs to engage, as mentioned by Flavia, the private sector, the civil society, the academia, and the citizens in the policy-making process. So by mainstreaming the SDGs into this, the policy-making process, we can obtain, cities and regions can really obtain a more sustainable development paradigm based on the 5 Ps of the United Nations. Next slide, Alina, please. This is my last slide. So one of the key outcomes of this first phase of the program was a checklist for public action to localize the SDGs. You can see here the report that was launched at the World Urban Forum about 2 months ago. So the idea is the checklist is based on 5 key blocks. The first one is about policy and strategy. So we just to see how to use the SDGs. The report is suggesting how to use the SDGs to define and shape local and regional development vision and strategy. Or the second one on governance is, for example, how to use the SDGs as a framework to align policy priorities and to manage sectoral trade-off across policies. The third component of the checklist is about mainstreaming the SDGs in budgeting processes to ensure that adequate resources are allocated for the implementation of the SDGs. The third point is about data indicators. So the idea is to leverage the SDGs data to guide policy and action and to measure territorial disparities. And the fifth pillar of the checklist is to use the SDGs as a vehicle to enhance accountability and transparency by engaging all the territorial stakeholders in the policy-making process. So again, this is the checklist that we are developing we are implementing in the 9 pilots of the program. And here I will stop and give the floor to Aziza.
Thank you very much, Stefano. So we really invite all of you to go and check on the report. If you go back to the first slide of the PowerPoint, which we will be sharing with all of you, you have the shortcut to access the report. You can read it online. You can access also the PDF via the OECD iLibrary. You have also a very short summary of 20 pages, which is more user-friendly. We really invite you to get it from the OECD's webpage and to make the most of it. And just so everybody knows, because of course this is not doing justice to all the work that has been done for the past year or so, that you have a series of additional reports that are coming over the next few months for each of the cities and each of the regions where we've been carrying out dialogues with different stakeholders and building consensus on the ways forward, but also doing this measurement exercise based on the indicator work that Paolo will be introducing in a second. So just for everybody's background, and because I know we have many of these pilots online, we'll have a report on the city of Bonn in Germany, on the city of Kopavogur in Iceland, on the city of Kitakyushu in Japan, and the city of Moscow in Russia. This is all in the pipeline for the coming 6 to 9 months. And there are also 5 reports that have to do with regions, the second tier of government, which is equally important because we know cities are very vocal, regions a bit less. So we've been working hand in hand with Flanders in Belgium, Southern Denmark in Denmark, Viken in Norway, Paraná in Brazil, and Cordoba in Argentina. For each of these cases, you'll have a standalone OECD report in the coming 6 to 9 months. Thank you, Stefano, and I'm sure this will trigger a lot of questions. We'll come back to that in the Q&A. And I'm now giving the floor to Paolo Veneri. Paolo has been leading the data component of that work and will take us through the black box of defining these indicators. Paolo, we have 455 people online. I'm sure your presentation will trigger much interest. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Aziza. First of all, good morning or good evening to all of you, depending where you are. My task here is before our colleague Marcos will drive you through the functionalities of the tool and show you what data we have. My task is really to briefly explain to you what indicators we have, what scales, which data sources, which methods, very briefly, so that you know a little bit what is behind this tool that we realized. So the first question that I would like to clarify is about the scale. So what are, at which scales we have indicator and we are publishing indicator in the tool. So if you are looking for your region or your cities, basically then you are in the right place, because the scale that we use are regions. What we call regions means, let's say, generally is the first administrative tier of subnational governments in OECD countries and some partner countries. To make you an example, in the case of Europe, for those who are familiar with the European classification of regions, this would be mainly NAS2 regions. For those who live, for example, in Canada or the United States, then we are talking about provinces or states, respectively. Then we have also cities. We also have indicators for cities. When we say cities, in this case, we cover cities of at least 250,000 people. We call also this type of units, we call it also metropolitan areas or functional urban areas. Why? Because we are not taking necessarily the single, let's say, administrative unit of the city, but in order to maximize the comparability of those indicators, we look at actually the entire, let's say, extent of the labor market of the city. Therefore, we look at the dense place, dense city, plus its surrounding commuting zone. So we look at where people, let's say, move every day to have a definition of city that is an economic definition that is the most appropriate to let's say, articulate indicators that can be compared across countries. So this is about the coverage. But then the second question, and if you, Aline, if you can go to the next slide. The second question is that, okay, what indicators do we have in this tool? So, and how we select those indicators? So the first important thing to say is that, okay, the UN framework, I mean, includes hundreds of indicators, and not all of them are available. We had to make a selection, we had to make a prioritization. Two main criteria were used to make such a selection. The first one is that the indicators should be place relevant. As you know, the UN framework is, let's say, was created at national level, refers at the national level. Here we are talking about subnational level of disaggregation. Therefore, it was for us, say, important that indicator is what we define place relevant. And when we say place relevant, for example, just to clarify, if, for example, we think about an indicator on the national legislation for labor rights, which is one of the SDG target in the official list. So that is not necessarily the most place relevant indicators, because there won't be, in theory, differences within countries. Instead, we want to highlight, we want to measure, let's say, aspects that can differ across the different regions or cities in a country. So this was the first criteria. And the second criteria was that, okay, there are many targets, many indicators, but we want to give priority to those that are most relevant in the context of OECD countries, therefore in the context of more developed countries. For example, if we think about, let's say, an indicator of undernourishment, then that is not the most relevant in the case of OECD countries. We would rather prefer an indicator like obesity rate, which is also included in the framework, and we think that is most, let's say, we kind of tended to prioritize this one rather than the first. So this is, let's say, the general approach that we identified to select the indicators. Overall, we have, let's say, we identified that at least 105 out of the 169 SDG targets can be considered as both place relevant and, say, relevant for the developed world. If you can go to the next slide, please. So the third question we want to answer is that, okay, how many indicators do we cover in this so far? Because this is a continuous process that is continuing, and we are trying to increase the coverage of indicators. But so far, we have around 130 indicators published in the tool that you will be able to visit online and to see in a few minutes. These 130 indicators allow actually monitoring the progress in 65 targets among the 105 that we define as relevant, let's say. Relevant from the place point of view and from the OECD point of view. As you can see from the graph in this slide, basically the coverage is larger. So the blue bars are the coverage in terms of indicators for regions, for subnational regions. And the gray bar reflect the coverage of for cities. And of course, as it is, I mean, visible from the graph, I mean, for regions we have much higher coverage in terms of number of indicators. If you can go to the next slide. Okay, so now another very important question. So what are the methods, what are the sources of data that we use to build all this big, say, database of indicators for regions and cities? So I want to highlight, first of all, that, I mean, we didn't start from scratch, of course. At the OECD, we are basically working with the Working Party on Territorial Indicators. It's an important network that basically allow us to collect a number of statistical indicators through questionnaires and directly from statistical offices. This year, actually last year, we managed to collect new indicators like obesity rate or student enrollment through a new data collection that was actually specific for this project. But that being said, we have another large set of indicators that couldn't be covered through questionnaire or through official data already available from countries. So we had to model indicators through specific data sources. So, for example, from geospatial data sources, from large surveys like Gallup, or like existing databases like the World Database on Protected Areas, and or the Global Database on Power Plants for energy-related indicators. If you can go to the next slide. Just to give you an example of this data, this is one randomly selected indicator for cities, for example, where we show in the SDG 11 that relates, it is specific to cities, the 11.3.1 land consumption relative to population growth. We were able to measure this specific indicator using geospatial data sources that are readily available with the world coverage. Therefore, we measure the growth, how fast, let's say, cities growth in terms of built-up area relative to population growth. And we can see from the graph that within the same country, there are cities that are actually declining in population while increasing the built-up area, coexisting with other cities where, with cities in which the population is increasing faster than the built-up area. This is one of the indicators of the framework, and we can actually monitor that over time since the 1975 to the most recent years. If you can go to the next slide, please. So coming to introducing the visualization tools, just want to remind what were the main three objectives that we had in mind to prepare the tool. First of all, allow all users, and users we particularly target policymakers and stakeholders, to identify the distance of their regions or cities to the SDG in a very easy way, because we understand the richness of the data and the large number of indicators. So we wanted to make it digestible to the user to go and pick the indicator that was say, in which there was interest, and look in a comparative manner what is the distance. Then also provide a comparison with the country. So each specific region could see, okay, with respect to the country, how distant I am in that specific indicator target to that target with respect to the country, and also with respect to other regions of the OECD, in particular the regions that we think are makes most sense to compare. For example, regions of similar size or regions of similar level of economic development. In terms of coverage, we have indicators for around 600 regions and for around 600 cities from all OECD countries, plus selected partner countries for which we add data. And in total, we have more than 100 indicators for regions and more than 40 indicators for cities. Now, if you can go to the next slide, Aline. This is the, let's say, screenshot of the homepage of the web tool. You also see again the URL that you can type in your computer or in your mobile phone to visit right away the tool. And if you go to the next slide, we can just see a few statistics on the use that we had of the tool since the release, so since approximately 3 months ago. So we had about 4.1 thousand unique visitors since the release, but more than 6,000 visits to the tool. And also there is a nice geographical distribution, as you can see from the map. Basically, you can see that the biggest bubble means that the cities from which we had the largest number of visits, which is Paris, where we had 379, which is the maximum number of unique users in Paris. If we rank the cities, let's say in terms of the largest number of users, basically we have Europe that is dominating the scene, with Paris, Lisbon, Brussels, Marseille, and Amsterdam being the cities that were most interested so far in the tool, but we see a lot of participation from North and Latin America as well, where you see from the bubbles that are pretty big, and so the situation in reality is pretty balanced across different areas of the world. And with this, I finish, and I'm happy to give the word to Aziza back. Thanks.
Good, thank you very much, Paulo, and we'll shortly get a speed training to get familiar with the tool with Marcos. Before that, second poll that we would like to invite you all to participate in. We have 463 participants online. Everybody can vote. Nicolina will help us see the question on the screen. OECD colleagues, when you vote from the Secretariat, just don't end the poll. So here is the question, and you can pick one. This is just to take a bit the temperature. We would like to know how familiar you are with the web tool. So there is a first option, which is I am aware of the tool and I have already used it. There is a second option, which is I am aware of the tool, but I have not used it yet. And there's a third and last option on I was not aware of the web tool before this webinar, and this is therefore the great opportunity to raise the awareness. So we have about 300 people that have responded. Let's wait a few more seconds. Numbers are still going up. We'll give ourselves maybe 20 more seconds until numbers stabilize. And then Nicolina, when you feel this is the case, if you can share the final results. Good, so everybody should be seeing by now. It looks like a good half of the audience today was not aware of the tool, so this is great. It's precisely one of the objectives of the webinar. A good half was actually aware, with a small share, a third basically of those aware having already used it and practiced it, and a good 2/3 being aware but having not necessarily been using the tool. So this is very good. Thank you very much. It gives us an idea of who's online and how we can tailor also the training. I think we now give maybe the rights to Marcos to be able to share the screen, and what Marcos will be doing over the coming 20 minutes is to basically go to the web tool and help you navigate. So you wish probably to follow that closely, or even, you know, to log in separately and try to do things in parallel. We'll have then after that a third and last poll, and then we'll have Q&A. Please send us your questions via the Q&A function. We have already 18 questions. We'll do our best to address all of them, and for those that won't have been responded in this webinar, we'll come back to you in writings afterwards. So if this is fine, I suggest that Marcos, you take over and you introduce the web tool to all of us. It may be slightly slower. There may be a time lag between what Marcos shows and what you see on the screen. Be patient with us, but I think the technology seems to work fantastically and we're on track. Marcos, you have the floor.
Thank you, Cisa, and thanks to you all for attending this webinar. So I'm sharing my screen, and just as a reminder, Zoom allows two different options to view. So you might want to, for this part of the presentation, move the views on the panel of presenters, for example, the video where I'm speaking, and just have a look at the screen, so you can have a very broad view of the tool. Well, this is just a recommendation. So here is the landing page. What I did is just to introduce the link. The link, you will have it in the presentation, and also in I think you have it in the flyer where you register to this meeting, so you can go after this presentation and explore further any aspect of the tool that you're interested in. So when I put the link, I land on this page, and this page is telling me that this is a tool to measure the distance to the SDGs in regions and cities. As Paolo already mentioned, we cover more than 100 indicators, and we have these indicators for either regions and cities. So the structure of the tool is that it allows to look at the performance of regions and at the performance of cities separately towards the SDGs. So that's why you will see, first of all, you will see that you have 2 parts on this landing page. On the left side, we have a map, and on the right side, we have a box. In this box, you have either the option to look at regions, and below you can see the definition of regions. You can click there and see all the details. I won't go there, but you can do it if you have questions about it. And then you can also either click on cities, and similarly below you will have the definition of what do we mean with cities, how do we build this definition, and what are the cities we're covering, etc. And when we move from regions to cities in these buttons, then we will have a list of below a list of regions and cities from which we can select the one that we want to look at. So there are 2 ways to explore a region or a city. One is through this box, and one is through this map. So if I know where my city or region is located, I just go to the map, and I will maybe look for the region of South England or Wales. But I can also just go to this box and say, well, I want to look at regions. And let's say I want to look at the region of Valencia in Spain. So I will just select the region of Valencia to see their performance towards each of the 17 SDGs. So I select Valencia and I click go. And then I land on this, what we call wheel, which will provide us an overview of Valencia in Spain. And so this wheel has many points and many labels, and so it might be a bit difficult to read at the beginning, but then we included here on the top left a small tutorial that says how to read this graph. You can click there and it will explain you or remind you what each of these points and lines means. I won't click on it because I will directly explain to you each of these elements. So what this wheel is showing is the 17 SDGs. We have icons for each of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And we created an index by goal. So we have 17 indexes to measure the performance of OECD regions and cities in each of these SDGs. And so, for example, we have the index for ending poverty, the index for ending hunger, ending health, improving health, and so on. But then the question is what is inside this index? So these indexes, which are normalized from 0 to 100, they contain the indicators that we use to measure each of the goals. So the number of indicators might vary across the goals, but you can quickly see what are those indicators if you hover over the icon of the SDGs. So if I hover over the icon of poverty, I will see that I have an indicator that talks about the average income of the households in the first quintile of the distribution per day. I mean, the average income per day. And I also have an indicator that talks about relative poverty, which is the percentage of households living below a certain line of life conditions and material conditions. But we also acknowledge that we might not be covering all the relevant indicators in each SDGs because there are data challenges. We are working to improve the coverage, but so far we still have some data gaps. For example, here we mentioned the 2 indicators we use for the index, but we also mentioned that perhaps we are lacking indicators about the quality of the housing, because the housing conditions are also related to poverty conditions, and we are not including this type of indicators yet here because we lack the data. For example, if we, just to give you another example, if we look at gender equality, we can see that we have indicators about difference in the employment rates or the kind of jobs. For example, if women have more part-time jobs than men. And so we have indicators for the labor market outcomes, but we also acknowledge that we are still lacking indicators about, for example, violence towards women, and participation of women in politics. We are working towards collecting these indicators, but the coverage is still not very broad, and so they are not included in this index. So when we read at these indexes, we have to keep that in mind so we can really interpret what we're measuring in each of these indexes. So the indexes that, let's say we have poverty, we have these two indicators. What we do is we normalize the indicators from 0 to 100, where 100 is the M value that regions and cities should be aiming to for 2030. So for, and this criteria to select the M values, it either comes from the UN indicator framework. They already said we should reduce mortality rates by that, we should reduce pollution by that. And so we get it from there, or we get it from the best performance in OECD regions. All these details are in the report. We will remind you of the link of the report so you can really check in detail these M values that we are using. So once we normalize the indicators from 0 to 100, we can aggregate them. And then, so each index will go from 0 to 100. 0 is the center of the wheel, and 100 is this dark line almost at the external part, I mean at the end of the wheel. So the closer you are getting to this black line is the closer you are getting to achieve the this kind of SDG based on the available indicators. So in this case, we could see then, and we can then go and interpret these points. So first, the blue point. The blue point is the selected region. Here, if I hover over it, it tells me it's Valencia, and it tells me its value is 49. So Valencia is really at the middle to end, for example, these relative poverty rates, or and increase the income of the bottom of the distribution. And then we can also see that we have another point that is a yellow one, and this is the average value for Spain. Of course, if I had selected as a region in France, the country average would be the country average of France. So this part allows me to see very quickly how is Valencia performing on each of the SDGs, well, on the available indicator for each SDGs relative to the country. But maybe I also want to look at the relative performance compared to their peer regions of Spain. And so in the left side of this wheel, I have selectors that allow me to add things to the wheel. So maybe if I click, I can add to the wheel the regions in Spain. It will show me the whole distribution. Every point, gray point that appear is a region in Spain, and maybe we can see that maybe the Basque Country is very close to achieving the M value for no poverty or no relative poverty, and maybe Canary Islands is a bit behind Valencia. But maybe I also don't want to see more about Spain. I want to include another region from another OECD country. And maybe I'm thinking about a region that is also Mediterranean and with a similar population. Maybe I can think of Tuscany in Italy. And so then I have this green point, which is Tuscany, because I want to see the performance of Tuscany. And then I can see that they're also very close to achieve the goal for no poverty, in relative poverty, not absolute poverty. But maybe in gender equality, they are a bit behind. So maybe Valencia has better integration of women in the labor market compared to Tuscany. And then I can just maybe get rid of this point, and I can play and well, look at other regions that might be more interesting. Then another, the last function of this section of the tool is that It comes from the fact that in many of our discussions, our stakeholders told us the tool should be a way to improve the policy dialogue. We want to have dialogues that are based on data, rather than just looking at rankings and saying who is best and who is worst. So also in this dialogue, we can learn about the practices of other regions that are similar to us. So then we are suggesting comparable regions to my selected region. In this case, we selected Valencia. So what does these regions, why are these regions being suggested? Well, the first one is suggested because first of all, we say from all the other available regions, which ones are performing better than Valencia overall? I mean, as an average. And out of those, which region is the most similar in terms of population? And among those, one of the most similar was Provence-Alpes-Côte d'Azur in France. And then another one that is perhaps performing better on average, but it has a similar GDP per capita, is Cantabria. So these two regions are a bit similar in some sense to Valencia, and they are performing a bit better. So maybe Valencia could learn from what these regions are doing in terms of specific SDGs. However, this part allows us to have a big picture. It doesn't allow us to see the specific indicators that are behind the index, and it doesn't show us the whole distribution in the OECD. So what I'm going to do now is to go to the second part of the tool, which is through this button. I can also click in one of each of this part of the pie, of the wheel, but I will do it through here. So if I click here, I will see the whole distribution by index, by SDG in the OECD regions. So I click there, and now I can see for the index of SDG 1, I can see the distribution for all the OECD regions for which we have data. Each pole is a region in the OECD. And we can see a whole distribution that starts from 0 and goes to 100, where 100 is the end value, is where we would like to be by 2030. And we can see that there are some regions that are very close to the end value, already achieved it, but there are others that are very behind. And then in this blue, dark blue, we see that Valencia, or selected region, was somewhere in the middle. There are also two colors here, the light blue on the left. This highlights the regions that are at the bottom 20% of the distribution. The dark gray highlights the top 20% of the distribution. And we can see maybe in the bottom, we see some regions of Turkey, some regions of Mexico. At the top, we might see some regions of even North Italy or Austria, Flanders, and so on. But now maybe we don't, the index is just an entry point. So now we want to look at really what is driving this index, and we need to look at the specific indicators. So here we have two bottoms next to this label of index. We say that one says indicators for the index, and another that says indicators, and it says others. So what we mean here is that this index is built with some specific indicators that we can see here, but there are also other indicators that we are not using to build the index, but they are relevant and they are informative to monitor SDGs, and we also wanted to make them available for you to look at them. So if I click on indicators index, then I will see the distribution opens, and now I can see the distribution by indicator. I can see the indicator of disposable income per day of the first quintile, and I can see it starts from very low values until higher values, and somewhere in the middle we have the end value, and we can see how far Valencia is from this end value. We could also see it for relative poverty. I won't get into details specifically for Valencia, it's just to show you how the distribution shows. And then maybe going beyond the index, I also want to look at the other indicators that we collected that also relate to ending poverty. And then I click in these indicators others, and I can see that I have for example, the decrease in poverty rates due to transfers, social transfers, and taxes. So this allows me to see how my social policy is improving relative poverty rates. And we can see that in some regions, the policy is more effective than in others. And I can see where is Valencia again. Then I also have, for example, here, rooms per person. And I can see that Valencia already achieved that one because in general, households have enough space, so they don't live in these overcrowding conditions. So that there you have an indicator where the performance is better, and so on. We can do this not only for poverty, we can also look at other indexes. Here, for example, I want to look at the distribution in the use of clean energy. And we can see that it's a very polarized distribution. We see also Valencia somewhere in the middle. And then I say, okay, let's see what is driving this polar distribution, bipolar distribution. So I want to look at the indicators, individual indicators. And now I have the share of the electricity that comes from renewables. And I see that this is the distribution, this is the indicator that is driving this bipolarity, because I have a big share of regions that are still having like close to zero use of renewable sources for electricity, while other regions, a big bulk of regions, are already transitioning to using high shares of renewables in electricity. This is not the case, for example, for coal or for fossil fuels, where we can see that there's still a big share of regions using those fossil fuels for production of energy. So this is, let's say this is the main part of the tool. Then this is the visualization part of the tool. Then just to finalize, I want to show you this part, the other part that is not to visualize necessarily, but it gives information. This is the about, it gives information about our rationale to measuring SDGs in regions and cities, the role of regions and cities to leave no one behind, and why we think this tool was necessary, plus a broad overview of what each SDG is intended to achieve, in case you need a reminder of what's the role of each SDG. And finally, something very important is the methodology and the data. So we go to the part of data here, and then we see that we have a brief explanation of where the methodology comes from. And we give you the link to the report. And we mentioned that in chapter 2, you can find all the technical details about how we normalize indicators, how we define end values, what are the specific indicators we are using, their units of measure, and so on. So there you can have a look and come back to us in case you have any question. And finally, the data. So we talk about the importance of transparency for policy making and for make our data trustable, reliable. And so we are providing to you everything that is being displayed in this tool. It's available for you here. If you click here in Get the Data, I will get a very simple Excel file. I'm opening the Excel file that contains all the data that this tool is displaying, plus other specific notes that are useful for you to navigate through this data. So now the Excel file open, and I just want to very quickly show you there are buttons that allow you to go to the different sheets of the Excel. So where you can see the dictionary that tells you the name of the variables we are using. It can tell you the complete list of indicators, and then it can give you either the indicators for regions, the individual indicators for regions, the individual indicators for cities, but also the indexes we calculated for regions, the indexes we calculated for cities, and the final list of regions and cities. Sorry, can you see the Excel?
No, we can't actually.
Oh, okay.
but we can share the link after. I think you can share one screen at a time. It's now we can see the Excel. I think.
Okay.
I
Okay.
see it.
So just very quickly, the Excel has different buttons here that allow you to see the dictionary, the complete list of indicators, the indicators for regions, the indicators for cities, also the indexes, and the full list of regions and the full list of cities we're covering, and how to quote this database. So just very quickly, I'll go to the indexes. Let's see the indexes for regions. Here you will have on the top left SDG. So SDG 1 is the index for SDG 1. We can see the names of the regions for Austria here and for all, but here I start with Austria, Australia, and all OECD countries. We can see the value of the index. You can see the country average, the OECD average, and well, the M value is 100 because it's the normalized indicator, the normalized index, I'm sorry, but the indicator will tell you the M value specifically in terms of the units of the indicators. And then here, this button allows me to just return back to the main page and then explore something else in this Excel file. So I think I can stop here, Aziza, and then we will solve your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcos. This was very sharp and 20 minutes to the point. I hope this was useful for the half of the 400 plus participants that had not navigated the tool before or were not aware of the tool. So we'll now open up for Q&A. Before that, we would like to invite you to take a last Zoom poll. Now that you've had an opportunity to learn from the tool, we would like to seek your guidance on what you think would be relevant for us to consider going forward. So Nicolina will make the poll appear. And here is the question. You should pick one. I know it's frustrating because maybe you expect the 4, but going forward, what should be the main priority to make the tool more relevant and useful? Is it for you to track progress over time? There's actually a few questions that relate to that. Is it to expand the number of targets that we are covering? So we're aiming at 105 as OECD and place relevant, but we have 60 plus indicators for them available. Is it to expand the number of cities and regions covered, in particular in non-OECD member countries? Is it to extract from these country profiles, you know, so you can see the regional and local disparities in Italy or in Spain or in any of the other OECD countries? So we have a good half of the participants who have contributed so far. So maybe we'll wait 15, 20 more seconds, Nicolina. When you are done and numbers stabilize, we can show what the main priority seems to be. Of course, the ideal scenario would be to have it all, but that gives us an idea as OECD Secretariat in terms of how to focus our efforts. So looks like we have a very good balance. The 2 first options are really track progress and development over time. A good third of participants consider this priority number 1. Alongside expand the number of cities and regions covered, so geographical coverage, top priority as well, followed by country profiles, which are important for a quarter of respondents, and then expanding the number of targets and SDGs. Thank you very much. I think we can stop sharing the results. We'll share this all with the PowerPoint presentation that you'll get, and you will, because some of you are asking on the chat, also receive the link to the recording of the webinar. And if this can be a way to spread the word and to facilitate the access of your constituencies to the knowledge that we've shared in this hour and a half, please feel free to do so. So now we're going to have a good 15 minutes to get some questions. There are many questions, and rest assured that we're taking notes of all of them, and we'll get back to you bilaterally if we don't get a chance. I've selected a few which I think Marcos and Paulo, you can maybe give a try, and then I'll have a few more for Stefano after that. So there are a number of questions, Marcos, about how you are defining the end value which I think is worth explaining indeed, and whether there's a link to the SDGs target and the 2030 agenda. There are questions on whether you have somewhere in your indicator framework measurements of greenhouse gas emissions, if you can put a spot on that one, and whether you have a good coverage for SDG 3 and SDG 11, which in these days of post-COVID are quite important to assess the recovery capacity of many of the cities. Someone is asking whether it would make sense to go granular to the neighborhood level in your index. I know you've been struggling with that, if you can make a point. There's a question about making progress of tracking progress over time, which you understand this tool is not doing, but can be a next step. So this one is easy. And then there are a number of questions, maybe Paulo, you can address these that probably relate to people that haven't heard your full presentation, but if you can remind or refresh our minds on how the data is collected. Is it national level? Is it local level? Is it regional level? And how you ensure that this is comparable. There are a number of questions on whether data is open source, if it can be downloaded. I think this has been responded in between by Marcos. Why is it only Google Chrome? I think that one is easy, and the other web browsers are not supported. Maybe how you selected relevant indicators. I would advise that the person asking that question just goes back to the PowerPoint. It makes it very clear. Where you get the data, how the data is collected, where we can know more about the different indicators. What do you mean by change in water bodies? If you can direct that person. So let's have you both maybe very briefly target these, and meanwhile I'm compiling a few more that probably on the policy side, Stefano and myself can cover. So who wants to go first?
Okay, I can go first, probably.
Please.
Thanks,
Go ahead.
Aziza. With some of the questions you made. Basically, the first one is how the data is collected. So just here I try to briefly explain in my presentation, but I will provide more detail. Basically, we didn't start from scratch, as I said during the presentation, the sense that the OECD regularly publishes databases at both scales, so for regions and for metropolitan areas. These databases are, let's say, are built first of all through thanks to the help of countries, to which we submit a questionnaire regularly every year with a list of indicators that we'd like to include in our databases. Of course, that the indicators are agreed with our delegates of the Working Party on Territorial Indicators. Just for you to know, this network, the Working Party is composed primarily from, let's say, people from statistical offices or agency that takes care about regional development in their countries, but there is a strong link with the statistical offices, which give us the indicators that we agree every year. And so this is the first, this data collection is done at the regional level, and it's the first important source that we have established now, I mean, many years ago, actually, and we are continuing. And the rest of the indicators actually are modeled by the team. Therefore, depending on the subject, depending on the specific topic, we can, let's say, bridge the data gap through different data sources. As I explained, we use from geospatial data sources to, let's say, to large survey data or administrative data. It really depends on the topic. And of course, everything we do is actually approved by the Working Party and is documented in specific reports or papers that are available either as an OECD report or as a research paper in the form of working paper or metadata notes that you find in our website. The other question was a very quick one. Why only Google Chrome? Actually, it is not only supported by Google Chrome. We suggest to use Google Chrome, but the tool is supported also by other browsers. The only one that is not supported, that to my knowledge, is Internet Explorer, because of technical requirements that of the technology used to build the tool itself. So it's not the tool that does not support the browser, but is the other way around. Sometimes the browser do not have all the, let's say, requirements to let's say to be able to show correctly everything that we want to show. Regarding the how to compute the index, maybe Marcos can complement on that, but just to I want to highlight one point is that the index is computed using some of the indicators that are within a goal. We do not necessarily use all the indicators that we have within let's say the umbrella of one specific goal, because of methodological constraints. For example, we don't mix in the same index growth rates with level indicators, but considerations like that are methodological and that ensure that the index that we are creating is not, let's say, too much bias, or does not have too many distortions. Last point on the scale of analysis. I know I saw in the question and answers that many questions were actually related to, okay, but could we go more granular to cities that are smaller or to neighborhood level, etc. Of course, this is a possibility, but there is a trade-off, of course, between the number of information available, the number of indicators that we are able to produce, and the number of countries for which we can compare the indicator, and the detail of the geography at which we can go, basically. So this is the main consideration. There is always an equilibrium that we need to find in this respect, but we are happy to advance on this front. Thanks.
Good, thank you, Paolo. Marcos, and then I have a few questions I'll spell out for Stefano, and I can probably pick one or two of them as well. Marcos, please.
I saw a question about the relation of our indicators to the UN framework and also to other initiatives. And so I would like to start by saying that once we identify what were the relevant targets for OECD regions and cities, or prioritaire, we try to use the suggested indicators by the UN framework first. Once we selected the targets and we thought, okay, these targets suggested by the UN are relevant for regions and cities in the OECD, we look at the indicators the Interagency and Expert Group on SDGs from the UN were suggesting. And so if we had these indicators, we use these indicators. When we didn't have them, we see we had good proxies that in some sense capture the essence of the target. And even though they might not be exactly the same, but for which we have a good coverage, because as you can imagine, covering 600 regions with the same indicator, it's challenging. And so just to stress, there's an overlap. It is not huge, but we started from there. So the link is in our process directly with the UN indicator framework. And then how do we select the M values? Also, we start from the recommendations of the UN. Sometimes they explicitly say in the target, oh, we should reduce mortality rate by less than 5, maternal mortality by less than 8, etc. And we then grab this target as the M value for 2030. Then if the UN was, the framework is a bit ambiguous in some sense that it just says, improve the use of renewable sources, well, that is very ambiguous towards how much is improving. And we look at the performance in the OECD regions and cities. So if we saw that in every country, there is at least one region that achieves around 70% of their electricity production from renewable sources, we got this kind of like the average of the performance of the best performers of each country, and said, this is something that is very ambitious, but is necessary for sustainable development, and at the same time is feasible because at least one region of your country has demonstrated that it's possible. So ambitious, but achievable M values for 2030. That's our main criteria when the UN framework is not clear about what's the end value. Then regarding for example, indicators about this, that could inform on this health crisis, well, we realized that with this health crisis, there's going to be a lot of discussions about the health capacity in specific regions. And we, in the SDG 3 for good health, we collected the indicator on number of beds per inhabitant and the number of doctors per inhabitant. We know that for COVID specifically, there might be other indicators more precise, like ventilators or intensive care unit beds. We still don't have those. We're not thinking about this one because it was before this crisis. But still, knowing the number of beds per inhabitant tells something about the capacity and the inequalities within country on this capacity, which is very important because sometimes the action has to be coordinated. For example, if in some regions you're having a high demand of people that requires attention, they are full, they don't have more capacity, but still you have a neighboring region with more available beds. This is information that we should have available in a timely manner. This is another challenge that this crisis is posing to us, is how do we integrate the real-time accessibility to the data so the response can be quick and more efficient. But well, these indicators, we have some there that are still important to talk about. Even post-crisis, we should be thinking, what is the resilience in terms of health of regions and cities? Because we know that we're at risk of more environmental risks, and so we need to be prepared to future risk. And so even by looking at a trend that is every year, we need to look at these disparities in health capacity. And then I think those are the main questions I retained. The others are more specific about specific indicators. For example, greenhouse gas emissions. We put some in the climate action SDG, the CO2 emissions that comes from the production of electricity. So it's just for production of electricity, but we have it for regions and cities by using this grid, which is public available data that Paulo mentioned, a grid that allows to see all the power plants to produce electricity at a very granular level. So from there we can estimate that. And I think the more details about how do we build specific indicators, you can find that very precisely either in downloading the database, we have the definition of the indicator, or in the report that you can access through the link.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcos. And just to, as a background, inform those of you that may not be aware that the OECD is also tracking the distance of OECD countries to SDGs. I think there were a few questions on, are you transforming the indicators to make them a bit more relevant for OECD countries than for the developing world? We've done it, of course, at the very local level. For example, indicators that relate to energy. We're not looking at the share of the population at local level that has access to electricity, because this is a given for many OECD countries, but the share of renewable energy, for example, in the energy matrix. So this work has been done here and there, and that often mirrors the work that was done by our colleagues from the Statistics Directorate at national level. Methodologies have been aligned, and this is part of, as I was saying in the introduction, the OECD-wide efforts to support the implementation of the SDGs and the OECD Action Plan on the SDGs that is led by our Deputy Secretary General, Mr. Schlagenhav, who's with us online, and that includes a measurement dimension, but not only. There are a few more questions. I think we've had managed to address most of them, but we'll get back to you bilaterally. Maybe three for you, Stefano, if you can touch upon them very briefly, and then we'll give the floor to both chairs of our working party for some wrap-up remarks. There are a number of questions that have to do with the private sector and how this is all relevant for private companies, for corporate social responsibility. If you've seen similar tools used in the private sector, I think you can touch upon that. There are a few questions also on how you think we should be measuring SDG 17 on partnerships, and whether you have work in the pipeline to do that. And then maybe a few set of questions which are more, how you use these data and these indicators as a means to an end to support, policy policy making, how do you convince? There are two very direct questions on how do you convince people that are not so convinced, notably the politicians. How do you reach out to mayor's office? How do you go beyond the quantitative data and help cities improve their strategies? So if you can, I'll give you 2 minutes, respond to this very briefly, and people can know more liaising with you bilaterally. Stefano, please.
I will do my best to stay in the 2 minutes. So on the private sector, yeah, this is a key question, because in all the pilots, we have been analyzing the role of in the various workshop and focus group, the role of the private sector for the SDGs. We are seeing that the private sector is very active on the Sustainable Development Goals, and is using this, the SDGs also to go beyond the idea of corporate social responsibility. So they are really integrating the idea of sustainability, the Sustainable Development Goals in the core business of the company. And in this way, this becomes also a hook to better work with the public sector. And this is why with UN Global Compact and Brookings, we launched a new expert group on investing in city through the SDGs that has exactly the aim to strengthen this partnership between public and private sector using the SDGs. The second question on SDG 17, that's another, it's one of the gaps that emerged from the first phase of our work. And this is why we are starting a new project with the European Commission on city-to-city partnership to localize the SDGs. And one of the main goals is really to expand the coverage in terms of measurement also of SDG 17 at the subnational level. This also builds on some work that we already developed with the European Commission on decentralized development cooperation. So how the partnership between cities in OECD countries and cities in developing countries can help to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Finally, on how we use the indicator to help politicians and to convince politicians to work on the SDGs. The first key message is that we really see the indicator not as the final goal of our work, but as a tool for policy dialogue, as was stressed several times during the discussion by my colleagues. And more concretely, what we did in the pilots is to use the OECD localized indicator framework that we presented you today, the context-specific data of the pilots themselves, and we try to identify which are the strengths and weaknesses for sustainable development, and therefore also how the SDGs can help policymakers and politicians to address some of these key challenges. So this will be expanded also in the report that we are going to launch, so we can continue. I can provide more information in the report or following up after the meetings.
Good. Thank you very much, Stefano. So Aline, if we go to the next slide, and it's now my pleasure to welcome our two chairs, and we'll start with Vincent Fouchier, the chair of the OECD Working Party on Urban Policy, that gathers senior level officials from the 37 OECD countries and a few partner countries every 6 months to discuss urban policy, and who's also the Deputy General Manager of the Métropole Aix-Marseille Provence. Vincent, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Well, it's my real pleasure to take part to this session and to give some concluding words. I want to congratulate all the OECD team and Aziza for the very lively animation of this webinar. I will stress only 3 ideas. The main added values of the tool, its role for urban policies, and the following steps. First idea. So we see here one of the main added values of the OECD. Once again, the OECD can help to change the world by offering new lenses to look at our common challenges. For almost 10 years, I've been chairing this OECD Working Party on Urban Policies, and here we have a new proof of the added value. I will just raise 5 of them. A joint effort between the OECD staff and the national delegates, but also a joint effort between several working parties. And I want to thank very much my colleague from the Working Party on Statistics, Alessandro, who will speak just after me. The second added value is a continued process to enlarge the usual economic lenses, like the GDP, to evaluate and help our local public policies. Third added value is a way to use space in the SDGs implementation. SDGs are no longer macro tools for the UN or other international organizations. We all recognize the space as a a way to implement these SDGs, and local action is needed to reach the global goals. The fourth added value is a unique international comparative tool. It's very impressive. And the fifth added value is a very nice way to valorize all these rich data in a web tool dedicated to all decision makers and stakeholders. My second idea is that the SDGs represent obviously an important tool for urban policies. Having now the opportunity to use the SDGs at the regional and urban scale will much increase their dissemination and help to impact much more on a local basis. It's not only a web tool that we have seen, but a crucial decision-making tool. And it helps us to forget none of the 17 SDGs, for instance, health. Just before the crisis, I'm not sure that all the countries, all the cities were dealing at the right level with the health indicators. Now, I think we are all convinced that we have to, but 17 indicators have to be dealt with. So the OECD web tool provides cities and regions granular data to redesign their planning, their budgets, their policies towards more sustainability. Considering the SDGs in the post-COVID recovery efforts in cities and metropolitan areas will lead to much more sustainable world. And I have to say that in Aix-Marseille-Provence, where I work, we will try to fully use this opportunity. And I've seen that Marseille is one of the most important places in the world where the SDGs tool is already much used. So I'm quite happy with that. It's promising. And my third and last idea is that this tool is just the beginning. It needs to be complemented. It has been said, and the pools have shown it. Some criteria are lacking, and the work is in progress anyway. The trends must be documented, more cities must be implemented in the tool as well. But anyway, it offers already now a radically new step to implement the SDGs locally, with a multi-scale coherence, helping dialogue between cities, regions, and national governments. And on top of that is transparency. So look, citizens, private stakeholders can also participate in a very wide movement. So just let's use it. And congratulations again to the OECD family for having produced such a very impressive tool. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vincent. Thank you, Chair, and also for your leadership pushing us to go beyond reports. You know, we are writing at the OECD 700 reports a year, so whenever we can have something that is a bit more user-friendly, we're trying to go in that direction. I know you've been very vocal, and probably there's a correlation with the fact that people in Marseille have been using it extensively. So let's continue that. Thank you very much, Chair. And now I turn to Alessandro Alasia, who's the Chair of the Working Party on Territorial Indicators, also under the Regional Development Policy Committee, and also the Assistant Director of the Center for Special Business Projects in Statistics Canada. Alessandro, you have the floor. So maybe you need to unmute yourself, Alessandro, just to check.
I did.
Good.
Thank you, Azina.
We hear you perfectly. Please go ahead.
Hopefully you can hear me and see me. Thanks so much for the opportunity to speak at this workshop. Again, almost 500 participants. Really speaks volume about the interest on this topic. So I also want to congratulate on this work and the effort that the OECD and particularly your team has put into this work. Let me start the question as a delegate from Canada and from Stats Canada. In fact, Statistics Canada is the focal point for Canada on the SDG, and we coordinate the collection and processing and dissemination of all the indicators for Canada. Stats Canada, in fact, has a dedicated website, an SDG data hub, which I invite you to visit, and you will see that most of the indicators are at the national level, but there are a number of indicators that are also disaggregated by region on many dimensions. For instance, SDG 8 on employment, for most of the indicator will have a regional dimension. And there is also there are also a number of indicators that are also in development. You will see indicator under development or exploring data sources. So still a lot of work to be done, and this is where the work that you are doing at the OECD is of particular relevance. Because again, I really like the way you frame the work of SDG as a framework that goes from engagement to policy, right? It's not only data, it's engagement, and then all the process that goes through until policy are delivered. So there is a very important dimension here of engagement with the various countries that I think needs to be continued. Also, when it comes to the selection of data and the validation of data, this is a very important aspect. So again, it's important that you keep this in mind, that we all keep this in mind, that there is also a process of discussion with the member country for the identification of the indicator and the validation. And the OECD has a very important role in this. And another aspects in which I think WPTI and the OECD has a very important role is in harmonizing and standardizing definition. Again, if you visit the Stat Canada website with the regional indicators, you would see that not all the, for instance, not all the indicators are produced for a definition of city that aligns with the OECD or other international definition of city, because each country would still have a definition of urban area and city or rural area. For instance, just to give an example, I know that OECD has done amazing work and is doing amazing work on defining urban, rural, and city, and so there's still more work probably that needs to be done with various member countries to align some of this definition. And here you really have an important role, and we have an important role as WPTI as well. Now, in terms of again, the role of WPTI and the contribution of the WPTI to this work, I see a lot of synergies. In fact, most of this alignment has already been presented by Paolo. WPTI maintains a regional database with over 100 indicators, over 600 regions. Many of these indicators align with the SDG indicators, so which is really great. I think more can be done also in terms of the emerging or new work that WPTI is now conducting on selected topics. For instance, accessibility and proximity measure is one of the areas on which the WPTI is quite actively working now, and those are certainly indicators that can feed SDG in terms of sustainable city and community, access to transportation, access to other type of service. And in fact, in this specific area, I don't want to contradict Paolo, but maybe to add to the discussion and debate, we could even think about neighborhood level indicator. I know this is very ambitious, maybe it's too much for many indicators, but on some specific indicator, in fact, we could even think about generating neighborhood level indicators that are harmonized or very comparable across OECD countries. And another area of work for the WPTI is business indicator. And some of these, again, could feed, for instance, SDG 9 on industry, innovation, and infrastructure. So again, there are a lot of possibility. My final comment is about, again, looking forward. I think one of the very interesting task for the future will be to monitor SDG over time, and particularly over the next couple of years, because we are in the middle of a major shock, a major crisis, COVID-19, and the shock is still unfolding, and to some extent fortunately things are improving in many countries, and some of the things are getting back to normal to some extent, but what is still not quite clear is whether the shock will have just a transitory effect, or there will be more long-term, lasting, and permanent effect. But early indications suggest that there might be some structural change and major effect that will be long-lasting. Again, I just mentioned one, the acceleration of digital transformation, the adoption of teleworking, and also adoption of digital technology in an educational setting and environment. And all of this will have impact on mobility pattern, on use of transportation, public transportation, and on the very fabric of urban area, right? Density and the way people move, retail. So what I want to say is that all of this will probably have effect on some of the SDG indicators. We don't know yet what will be the net effect and what will be the final impact, but it will be certainly very interesting to continue to measure this, because we might discover that in 2 years we might discover that this crisis has really allow us to achieve what was considered almost unattainable 2 years ago because of all this transformation, while on other indicators maybe we can see a deterioration of conditions. So it will be very interesting to monitor the change in indicator and SDG indicator over the next couple of years. And again, I think WPTI and the OECD have a very important role to play here. So hopefully we'll continue to work on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alessandro, Chair of the Working Party on Territorial Indicators, and for your leadership to push the measurement and statistical frontier. This brings us to the end of the webinar. We're almost on time. Sorry for the slight run over. I would like really to thank all the speakers and all the participants for joining. This has been recorded. We'll share the background presentation, the survey results, and the recording link with all of you. I would like really to thank our 3 chairs, Flavia, Alessandro, and Vincent, for your leadership and for pioneering this work with the OECD Secretariat. Our director, Lamia Kamal-Shawi, our deputy director, Joachim Oliveira Martins, they've been really strong advocates of this work. The dream team that you've heard from, Stefano, Paolo, Marcos, but also those you've not heard from and that made this webinar and the underlying work happen. Aline, Lawrence, Mia, Nicolina. Thank you, Alex, and the IT team. Let's keep the conversation going. Thank you all very much. Have a nice afternoon, evening, depending on where you are. And we'll be in touch for next developments on the SDGs. We're stopping the broadcast here. Thank you all very much and have a great day.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.